Yeah, I thought I'd try and summarise the World Championship match just gone in this hour. So night 18. So let's see. How's the board, by the way, on YouTube? Also streaming to YouTube. I'm just going to check that the board seems okay. I hope. Board seems okay. Yeah. Right. So let's have a look at that first game. So we had that World Championship. Let's look at the first game. So Knight F3. I thought I'd do just a quick overview and summary of the World Championship match. So it started off with Raretti, and I thought psychologically in the first game we witnessed Magnus being a bit nervous, and he talked about settling in to the match, and it was actually so a very, very cautious opening start. You can see obviously my detailed videos for detail. Just from a sort of overview perspective, the opening didn't really give Magnus much at all in the first game. He went for a double fianchettoed bishop system, and now we saw bishop f5, and it looked as though Vichy at this stage, the first game of the match, was very, very comfortable here with the black pieces. And Magnus, I don't know if this is out of nerves, but it's just a couple of very simple forcing moves here after knight d7. He played knight c3, just allowing c4 to be vulnerable, and it just looks as though this was. So to be honest, I thought it was it wasn't a great demonstration. I wouldn't have thought someone over 2800 would get this position. It just seemed incredible that he weakened d5 and allowing knight c4. I thought it was an incredible start for Vichy to have in that first game, where okay, this pawn's here. It's not exactly a backward pawn on d4, but this knight's pretty annoying. I guess white hasn't got any concrete things which are that easy to exploit, but knight d5, and there's just pressure on the white position, and it was clear that on taking, for example, ct, I mean that would be a very, very nice knight to have installed on c4. So Magnus did, in his own words, have to sort of put the emergency brakes on here, and for me, I couldn't believe the game was over before 12 in the afternoon. I expected the games to last quite a few hours. Otherwise, I probably would have commented on them live. And I couldn't believe, at move 13, we had really a non-entity game. After Queen b3, it just seemed like a complete non-entity game. I think engines were suggesting b5 here for taking, and then knight a5 to try and do something interesting, but it's not needed. If Vichy seemed content though for a draw here. Probably if he did want to try for a win, he would have been exploiting the nervousness of Magnus Carlsen in the first game, because this just seems unbelievable that Magnus had this position with black's bishops doing very, very well here. This bishop's back at base. Maybe b5 was the way to carry on if he'd carried on playing here. I don't know, but this repetition kind of allowed Magnus just to start settling in to the match, really. So it was an incredible repetition. Very, very short first game. It's like of course spectators were kind of annoyed and were hoping for much more on the second day, but it just seemed like an unbelievably short game ending in this repetition. And apparently there's this like 30 move rule that unless it's a repetition or something like that, the game should be more than 30 moves. So we have this freefold repetition here which forced that. Let's have a look at the second game. So you could say that Magnus Carlsen was apparently, people were saying he was kind of nervous in the first two games in particular. So the first game in particular. So the second game. So he's black, and I thought this was a much better played game for Magnus overall. He used a rock solid system. It kind of surprised maybe Vichy in the opening, playing the Caro-Kann defense, and he did achieve a very nice equality. One little surprise in the opening was just allowing this knight e5, which I always kind of assumed actually that this was a mistake, that you're supposed to play knight d7, but apparently not. So a little bit of opening theory I think was picked up, probably by quite a few people here, to allow this knight e5, and it just seemed to get there's a little trap here which should be avoided. This queen takes d4, this knight takes f7. It's a bit of a pain. So black took on d3. I mean, there's some more complicated stuff with bishop b4, but it's still a trap after c3. I mean, if taking knight takes f7. Let's not get into that. But the point is that Magnus comfortably kind of equalised with black. He threw in this bishop b4 check. And I guess one thing that may have surprised some people is just castling calmly on the king's side. But apparently, I think he'd in the post-mortem analysis of this game, he seemed quite confident that his king was going to be safe in these lines with queen g4. So this was the point where Vichy could have tried something queen g4, but there seemed to be some responses with king h7 and f5, which didn't make it that lucrative. But the way it was played now, I don't know if this was a tiny missed opportunity to put some pressure early on Magnus, because it does seem the sharpest move. But Magnus was pretty confident he was holding the position if queen g4. But what we got was instead an early exchange of queens and the promised excitement of castling opposite sides of the board. Just didn't lead to, again, I mean, incredibly, it just led to this threefold repetition because of this continuous threat of bishop takes h6 and the f7 pawn. So incredibly, I think, and this is where I thought, the spectators of the match were starting to get really disappointed. But I think Magnus was starting to settle into the match by this stage. And in game 3, we really started to get a couple of really good fights. So the first one in game 3, let's have a look at. So game 3 started to be quite a meaty game. So Magnus kicked off again with knight f3, and he varied quite early with this early c4. And this is the kind of position which I think he's kind of done well in other games in the past, with a kind of reversed Sicilian sort of dragon, I know, castling kingside. If white can use that c file, there's a promise of a sort of nagging pressure which Magnus is very good at using. But let's see what happened. Bishop d2, knight d4. Quite committal from Vichy to try and change the structure to put pressure on e2. So white took knight e4, but it seemed to be okay again for black. He seemed again to be in a comfortable position. Vichy was in a comfortable position here, and after a5, it seems, again he's just neutralized Magnus, and I think people were starting to think that the rating difference wasn't that significant actually. That black, again, in this game, he really didn't have any problems much, it seems, in the opening. Something interesting did occur though, this kind of queen going to h1 in a very hyper modern method of having the queen kind of to back the fianchettoed bishop. So he had c5, and I thought that was the first kind of concession that Vichy had to make in the match. He's weakened some light squares. Could Magnus do anything with that? But on the other hand, he's got these rolling pawns and this bishop pair, which is quite dangerous. So the imbalances kind of balanced each other out. And this was the really amazing, I think, first show that Magnus is starting to be more comfortable in the match, and he's playing quite a dynamic move here, e3. Otherwise he did risk being significantly worse if he let this pawn mass just come towards him. So this was, I think, a very key move, at least from a human point of view. I think that the engines didn't really think much of this at all, but from a human point of view, it's coordinating a number of pieces potentially on e6 when the rook's blasting down here, and we've got things like bishop h3, or maybe even potentially bishop d5s. There's coordinating all the pieces. It's very dangerous to pressure, and Vichy kind of bottled out of taking this pawn here because he didn't really see anything that's clear. He just played bishop d4, and it still looked as though black was on the verge of something significant here, but it's started to become clearer now that if white's very, very careful in getting that pawn back, then white shouldn't be at a major disadvantage because he has got the opposite colour bishops, and this can favour attacking pawns which are very difficult to defend. And this kind of held the balance just about for Magnus, that he was able to take the pawns safely, and it now just kind of fizzled out after rook d8, even though black's just the pawn up meant nothing. We've got things like check and attacking here, so the pawn was quickly given back, and then we had another draw. But the thing about this draw, I think it started to show that Magnus was starting to play really good moves, and this was the first meaty kind of game. I mean, the first two games were kind of a bit odd, a bit short, and kind of nervous feel to the first two games. So here, I don't know if it was like a little bit cheeky. Magnus just carrying on and on in this completely drawn position, but he's giving an indication there he's willing to fight to the end to try and get a win at some point. So okay, so that was our first meaty game, game 3. Then in game 4, so let's see what happened in game 4. Just an overview and summary. So Vichy playing white played e4, and we had this Berlin system, which was the system which brought down Garry Kasparov when he was playing against Kramnik. It's such an ultra solid system, but we had something exciting happen in this game. Even this dull line where the queens get exchanged off, something quite exciting happened, that Vichy somehow, I don't know if it was outside of the scope of his preparation, but somehow when the bishop came to e6, it does look at both sides of the board quite nicely. There's no entry points for the rooks, but it does seem logical and harmonious, the position. It shows also you can't really seem to get much unless you're, I don't know, it's very, very difficult to get an edge against this Berlin defense. And what we saw here coming up, so protecting e5 here, attacking c5, we saw this knight e2, which in the press conference Vichy said, well, he didn't really see much else to do here. So, and people like checking this, thinking, is this pawn, was it a hot pawn or not? And so we had echoes of a Fischer-Spassky match. The first game in that was there was a poison pawn that Fischer took and he lost. But Magnus dared to take this, nearly getting his bishop trapped, but it's got an escape route to come, as we saw, on this diagonal, funny enough, to get back. So it was quite a dramatic escape sequence to get the bishop out like this. And it seemed that this was starting to be a very, very exciting game. So we have now definitely a material difference on the board, and white has like dynamic compensation. I think this was the first game which I would call quite exciting. I don't know about you guys. This was, so game 4 I thought really was quite an interesting game, by my standards of interesting, which might be different to anybody else's. But I thought this kind of dynamic position where white's trying to prove some compensation for being a pawn down, and we have also this target on the C file, which potentially was quite vulnerable, and some interesting resources in this position if you look at the detailed analysis video. But knight b5 was striking and cool. That c7 could be a victim, and here there might have been an opportunity to go for something, but Vichy started ruling out things. He didn't see anything clear. That's the problem. It's like almost things were almost working here, but he had to bail out of any attacking options because he just couldn't see things working, and his analysis was actually very, very convincing in the post-mortem of the game. That the engine seems to think, he was right, as far as I could see, that there was no major blow to land on black. But we have a very, very dynamic position where Vichy he sacrifices soon another pawn. So we have this pawn sack here, knight e4, giving up g4. I just thought this is really quite exciting stuff. But so here it seems though that despite all this pressure, that black started maybe to go wrong. So Magnus was maybe a tiny bit still nervous. He started to go wrong, especially up until this point. I think it was about equal again, that his extra pawn hasn't been realised. But we had evidence that he is still trying to create lots of tricks in the position. He's not just exchanging off and agreeing a draw like we would have had perhaps in the year before in the Gelfand match. So Vician against Gelfand. What we had here is Magnus setting some little problems soon, and a very, very nasty trap which had to be sidestepped was coming up here. In fact, a very cruel trap where Vichy only had like minutes on his clock, something like a minute and a half, and there was kind of an evil trap here set with rook e6 that if taking b5 would have been absolutely winning. Personally, I found it quite astonishing that with only a minute and a half, Vichy managed to avoid this lethal trap, and was like a cool as a cucumber in playing all the right moves here to get to the time control safely. So giving up his e7, knowing he's going to get this g4, but he throws in a check to make sure he's keeping the king down, away from being active, and then getting g4 calmly. I thought this was incredible calmness under huge pressure from Magnus, approaching the time controls. And now this a4, it actually doesn't matter if black wins that pawn temporarily, and we get this draw, which I thought really showed that Vichy could really hold a lot of the pressure that Magnus was throwing at him, even in great time pressure. But now we come up to a crunch game of the match in game 5. So what happened in game 5 which took Vichy over the threshold of being able to hold a position? Let's have a look at game 5. So this is a very, very interesting game, game 5. So it started with the English opening c4. So we had e6, d4, d5, and we had this kind of surprising move that I don't usually see, this early e4. Well, not with the view of not going into the dangerous Marshall Gambit variation of this system, which would have been bishop d2. Instead, Magnus goes for a line which is known not to really give much of an advantage. He is moving a piece twice and is allowing black to kind of get a grip on a fair enough grip on the centre. And it's not much of a rated line, but it seemed to suit Magnus down to the ground, that the opening got him a decent position, quite a decent position. You can see here there was the markings of a 3-2 pawn majority. And he didn't mind this little bit of pawn structure fragmentation on e3, which helped simplify the position, because black still had that problem piece on c8. And we get basically an endgame, virtually an endgame scenario now, with the queens coming off, where white just retains a small something in the position, a small edge. So Magnus liked this position here. I think in the press conference he said like better pawn structure and like a better bishop. So I think he kind of liked this position to work with, but it did require some inaccuracies from black. Black started off playing very, very aggressively with this rook b5, and there was a point in this game where Magnus thought he'd missed a key move coming up. This rook d4, he had kind of maybe underestimated it, and maybe wasn't entirely best pleased with this position here. But what happened here was quite interesting. That Vichy seemed to have an opportunity to knock out the a pawn coming up. So he could have also just played g4 here, but he went for this a4. G4 would have been protected by the bishop. So this is an important moment coming up here, where black in this position, okay, played rook d1, check, and the bishop moved, and we saw that black could have actually gone and taken this a pawn with rook a1. I think this was one of the engine suggestions, because if king b2, we've got the check and we win that a pawn. And as it turned out, the a pawn miraculously started to play a decisive role in the position, because so it was left there, and you wouldn't think the a pawn in this position of all white's pieces would be that threatening here. It's the one most locked down by two of black's pieces. But it just turned out, okay, that it is pretty dangerous, this passed a pawn. And we saw something really quite clever from Magnus in this rook and pawn ending, namely a dynamic kind of pawn sacrifice to maximise the chances of this a pawn queening. So black had blundered by this stage technically anyway, but white just let the pawn go here. And it just seems a great cruelty of the position that the rook is in no position because of this pawn to get behind the pawn. This pawn is just quite quick in this position in conjunction with rook a4. It just seems a very, very unfortunate rook and pawn ending to lose. And I think this is where Vichy started to get really, I think he was pretty, this was a bad blow to him psychologically. I think the reason for that is he had already sort of noticed during the year he was blundering sometimes where he wouldn't have been in the past. These kind of blunders creeping in. It's not to do with his great originality of ideas or anything. It's just implementation issues I think he was alluding to that were creeping in this year. And to lose this rook and pawn ending is just really quite unfortunate. This was the start of the end, because it kind of, I think, reinforced some insecurities that Vichy had about the match. You know, it's not his ideas or creativity, it's his implementation of the ideas. I think it wasn't a bad game, he just missed out on some drawing opportunities. And some some people have been saying that Magnus didn't really play that creatively. It was like his athleticism would have helped, and that is tied down to implementation. If you've got playing for hours and hours, you can get tired more easily than your opponent, and then some errors creep in. But to be fair to Magnus, he had the kind of position he has been excelling at from the opening of this game, where he likes to grind down people, where other grandmasters would have drawn. So game 5 was the first, I think, major blow of the match. So in game 6, we had something which I found, again, showing the endgame pressure of Magnus was just unleashed in this game, where Magnus kind of had a position which was quite comfortable from the opening, and we get this simplification soon, fairly soon, where it seems Vichy what didn't mind all the minor pieces coming off, and there was this kind of mysterious giving up a pawn, thinking maybe the rook and pawn endings like trivially drawn anyway, even if he lost a pawn. So where this mysterious move that came up, which just gave up a pawn around about here. So queen g3, giving up pawn, but fairly confident perhaps that he'd easily draw this. And this is at move 38, so we've got the time control at move 40, so loads of extra time is going to kick in. So he loses a pawn, but I think it seemed to be, I mean, it's easy for any spectators to say now that this plan he chose, I mean, to be honest, it seemed very, very clever at the time to give up another pawn to try and fragment black's pawns. It seemed kind of clever, but Magnus does seem to play these endgames with great dynamism. He didn't mind. He embraced having the double pawns, and because he kind of factored in this could be a battering ram for this G pawn, for the F pawn to fly down. And I think that is incredible vision here, to see that the dynamics of this structure in this unbelievably simple looking, it was simple looking, rook and pawn ending, could actually give back black, by any stretch of the imagination, some winning chances. So it was incredible really what happened here, that white was actually stretched in this rook and pawn ending. I just didn't expect this to happen, that Magnus kind of set this kind of trap for his king coming across pretty soon, where there was like a key move, I think, to instead of here, I think just to try and keep this king from coming into the position, which was missed. I think it was here to have to play rook c8, I think, and still with accurate play needed, but the king came in a bit quicker, and all of a sudden we have this undermining operation coming in for this fast f pawn, and I thought this was pretty incredible. And if you put this into an engine, I think it was here that there's actually only one move, which could have saved Vichy, which was b4, and the engines are coming out b4 equal. But you know, Magnus is just breaking people from these simplified positions. I think people said that of Fischer grinding out games in these long end games. He wasn't giving people draws easily, but this is now, after rook a4, it's actually losing because of this very, very quick f pawn. I wouldn't have really expected this. You know, such, you know, a strong player as Vichy, I don't know about you guys, to have lost in this rook and pawn ending scenario, where this one pawn is actually quicker than the two connected passed pawns. So again, this was the second major blow of the match, where we've got this very fast running pawn, and like the other game, it's passed pawns which have decided these two games. This passed pawn's unstoppable now, and this king's just coming to e3 and the rook's just guiding it down. So that was 2-0 up now for game 6. So I think what happened psychologically in the first two games, I think Magnus was just kind of nervous, and there were like non-entity games. The third and fourth games started to be real fights, and the fifth and sixth, winning 2 games in a row, started to show, you know, what Magnus had said in the final match interview, was that he just started to do what he was doing all year. He just started treating it like his usual tournament, you know, grinding people down, and I think you could say he got into his comfort zone. So he's just getting over the fact that it's for the World Championship, and just getting into his comfort zone, doing what he's done successfully in the usual tournaments. I don't know what you guys think of that. So he was definitely, I think, by this stage, in his major comfort zone. So game 7 now, it seemed to be that in game 7 and 8, Vichy was kind of annoyed by the 2 losses in a row, and didn't mind trying to just you know, try to avoid losing at all costs. So this choice of variation perhaps surprised and shocked quite a lot of people. But I think with 2 losses in a row, I think he was kind of a bit annoyed, and didn't mind this game to be a draw. It seems as though White wasn't playing for a huge advantage, and this H-file operation didn't really have that many exploitable targets, even if a rook infiltrated. So we have basically some simplification, and it seems Vichy didn't mind. There's no d4 because of queen e4. He didn't mind this simplification, and we get this draw, which at least stemmed the tide of the 2 losses. But because it's such a short match, I guess it kind of, you know, 2 games in such a short match, it is a major handicap. And Magnus was very content to draw this. It's one step closer. So let's go to game 8, and this is a very this is kind of a non-entity game for Magnus, where everyone was surprised that Vichy didn't play actually this, something more fighting like the Sicilian defence here. He really needed to claw back from his 2-0 deficit, and he chose the Berlin, which is solid and reliable, but not usually to play for a win with the black pieces. So people were surprised here, and Magnus chose a variation psychologically, well, not just psychologically, practically, which looks as though White's just played the exchange French variation, because both sides are just showing, it's such a dull pawn structure here, both sides just showing that E file. And I think this is one of the most dullest games of the match because nothing really of interest happened, except there was something minor in the variations with here Queen G5. There was a minor interest point that Queen G5 lost to F4. So if the Queen went to F5, we've got check. If the Queen went to H, this is just in the variation which didn't happen, and if the Queen took, we've got Rook F1, for Knight F6. Okay, so but the Queen just went back, and we just have a position here where Black plays a clever move, Knight G7, not minding Knight F6 check because there was Queen takes F6. So White forcibly sympathised with Queen takes E8, and Magnus didn't mind at all a draw, and he said, he wasn't really in the mood to give much of a detailed explanation of this game in the post-game conference, just saying, well, we blah blah blah, and we go on for drug test or whatever to make sure they're not on drugs or anything, or stuff like that. So this was a total non-entity game in a way. And they played on a few more moves to get past move 30, I believe. So that's why they played these moves. So they got past move 30 and draw. But now, Magnus is quite happy to lose a white just to draw another game to get even closer. And then what we have, we had this rest day. And after the rest day, I think there was a great pressure, perhaps put on Vichy, that he must try for a win in game 9. And what we got, I think, was the most interesting but also kind of tragic in some respects game of the match. I don't know what you guys think of this game in terms of analysis. I mean, and in beauty of variations, there's a lot of variations which Magnus thought he was on the verge of being mated, and Vichy played an opening which you thought this could be striking at Magnus's weaknesses, that if Magnus has got any weakness, sometimes he comes off badly in openings. So this is kind of a sharp system with F3, and White got the bishop pair, so he's ready to do something quite dynamic in this game. There's a lot of dynamic imbalances rich from this opening, and this C4 looked, I thought, like a crazy move in some respects. It's not usually played here, and Magnus, I think, said after, I think he mixed up something in his opening. I don't think he was best pleased with the opening got, but he just was calculating a lot to make sure in this game that he wasn't going to get mated. And G4 just fits in with the position here for the knight to come to G3, and it looks as though White had very promising attacking prospects as well as the bishop pair, but Black is not without resources to use, for example, this third rank. But it seems as though White had lots of options in the centre on the king side. So what exactly happened here was quite remarkable. Magnus just took on C1 here, getting rid of White's bishop pair. And then we have this situation where there's this major choice coming up after B4, which kind of confused Min, Alex and Paul. I thought we were thinking this pawn structure, is it about the pawn structure? And I thought it was quite incredible what happened here, that it wasn't about the pawn structure undermining, but rather just about generating a passed pawn on the queen side. I think there were some criticisms of Vichy, taking here and exchanging off a rook. Maybe his attacking prospects would have been improved with the extra rooks on the board. I think that was one opinion that was quite popular here. So exchanging off the rooks meant perhaps that this pawn is actually more significant. Even if it ties down the rook, that could be used in the attack. We had a very, very dramatic position, and Magnus himself described these pawns as quite menacing. So I think he was concerned. This was the game which caused him perhaps the greatest concern for being mated for the whole match. This is where king's safety, I think, had to be very carefully calculated. The king's getting visited by a lot of attacking pieces here. But Magnus just creates this pawn. He doesn't bother undermining the pawn chain. And I thought this was really incredible stuff. And what happened next, I think, shows that Magnus has great open-mindedness in chess. Because something about this position coming up here is, I would have thought the natural blockade square would have been e6 for the knight. And to play knight e6 at some point for covering g7. And what was played seemed visually, not that appealing to lock in the rook here with knight e8. But it turns out Engine's suggesting this is the only move to stay in the game. I don't know how many of you thought this knight e8, in all honesty, was going to be played rather than knight e6. But on e6 it was a bit more of a target to potential bishop h3s and stuff like this. The bishop is also just having an open view on that diagonal. So it was actually an incredible concept just to block in the rook and have this confidence that this pawn is tying down this rook. So white didn't seem to have, after knight e8, a concrete winning attack. It's incredible that this happened like this. So Vichy really needing a win, but Magnus cool as a cucumber defence, and his pieces just look like cheekily positioned, all on the back row here, with his one advanced pawn tying down a major attacking resource. So I think this just shows incredibly cool calculation under pressure. To know that his B pawn is ruling out any serious concerns about being mated here. And we had this incredibly abrupt ending to this game, where a lot of variations with bishop f1 had been analysed and ruled out for nearly winning. For bishop f1, I think it was queen d1, rook h4, queen h5, this kind of stuff. Bishop f5. That all this kind of stuff had to be calculated, and also even here bishop h3. And Vichy had seen this crazy stuff where queen b6 unfortunately is calmly drawing because of the perpetual check. White's one move away from delivering something significant, and this is a Vichy and then variation he had seen. So he must have been gutted with this stuff, that this defence with these pieces here was just holding up his attack with this pesky pawn as well, doing a lot of damage. And a lot of calculations were involved with bishop f1, which didn't seem to work, and he ended up playing a move which had a weakness of the last move, because it kind of weakens this diagonal, which becomes very apparent soon after queen e1, that the queen can just sacrifice itself on h4. And it was a tragic end to what was, you would have thought it would have been an attacking masterpiece, this game, but it was a cool as a cucumber defence with all the pieces seemingly justified. Even the paradoxical idea of blocking the rook was justified. It kept the bishop with a view on this diagonal. It was a resource which incredible resource and defensive setup for Magnus to envisage. So the damage had been well and truly done now. 3-0 up. Vichy had showed that he really did try for this win after the rest day. And this tragic end to it. His attacks just vanished. So Queen E1 this blunder with knight F1. So the final game. So in game 10. So Magnus playing white, and he just really needed a draw now. So it will take a complete miracle for Vishy Anand to win 3 games in a row against Magnus Carlsen. I don't know when Magnus Carlsen has lost 3 games in a row, but Magnus playing white chooses this variation which offers a small advantage out of the opening, and we have this Maroczy bind, this dreaded Maroczy bind, and black usually doesn't get too much counterplay, but I think that there was a moment where Magnus did succumb. Maybe he just wanted to coast to get to secure his draw, but there was actually a technical blunder, believe it or not, in this game, which I hadn't mentioned, embarrassingly, on my video, because I was with Magnus's psychology here that all he needed was a draw, and something quite interesting happened, that Vishy had actually blundered quite badly at one point coming up here. With the move Queen G5. This was actually a bad blunder. And we're actually in a totally untested position, unanalyzed, from Vishy Anand after knight E8. I don't know how many of you have seen the analysis of this position, but this totally was unintended, this position here. Do you know White's strongest move in this position? I was with the psychology that White just wants to take care and get the queens off and draw. That's why somehow it didn't occur to me that there was an idea that White actually had a really good position here. If I gave you all 20 seconds to have a look at this, what do you think is a really, really good move for White if you were playing for a win? Can anyone see that? There's a really, really good move here. But the psychology of it was that Magnus just needed a draw from this game and he'd become world champion. So it's not really such a big deal. It's not showing a major defect in Magnus Carlsen's technical ability. I think he was pretty sure that E takes D6 was good enough to get an advantage. And I think maybe he even missed... I seem to think he missed that black could get the pawn back comfortably. Okay, here there was a technical opportunity to use this pin. It's untested territory that Vishy hadn't intended to go into this. In fact, it seems that knight c3 is one of the strongest moves. There's also knight g3. And it seems black didn't really have any moves here for white intensifying the pressure with knight a4 to b6. This would just be a very, very bad position where black's just waiting here, unable to do anything positive about this pin. So I think knight a4 coming into b6, it's pretty bad stuff. But as I say, Magnus, he's just so close to his childhood dream. I think he can be forgiven for just very quickly playing e takes d6, even though that pin seems absolutely lethal. But e takes d6, and what we got here was, miraculously, I thought it was just going to peter down for a quick draw, but we got here a position where, okay, white slightly improved with the king being able to come up here. I thought, if anything, okay, white still got good prospects, but things started to get a little bit tricky, incredibly. So there was quite a bit of excitement still left in this game. And we get this kind of dynamic endgame where Magnus managed to, I think, spend a long time here to make sure that his losing chances were kept to a minimum. So he had his own knight trapped, tactically, getting trapped here, knowing that he's going to take one of these pawns off to avoid e5 being absolutely decisive. And then this endgame, he just, I think, believed, he just knew he couldn't lose this endgame because of his pawns against the knight. There's perpetual check, lots of perpetual check scenarios to guarantee a draw, and this occurred here because if the king stepped out, there would always be queen b6 and then no mating material. So Magnus became world champion from this game. Slightly flawed, missed opportunity, but who cares? He became world champion from it. The damage had already been done in the previous rounds. So okay, it wasn't a demonstration of great opening innovation or originality. It seems as though Magnus was playing to his strengths, which he demonstrated throughout the year, that he was grinding. This ability to grind out in simple positions might be one of his major relative strong points to other GMs, this great determination and will to win. So I don't know if you got anything from this quick overview. I hope it was okay. Next week it will be at the same time, hopefully with fewer technical issues at the start. So yeah, I didn't really probably get the timing right for this to be an hour, but I hope you got something from it. So see you next week at 8 o'clock, same time. I'm glad we are able to run this on YouTube as well as on Play Chess. Okay, so thanks very much. See you next week. Comments or questions on YouTube?